But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
All right, lift off and the clock is starting. Yes, sir. You can allow it.
Roll program. Complete and attended program.
Roger, roll, Roger. Stand by for 1 Bravo.
2.5G.
Mark, 1 Bravo.
5.5. Oxygen is go. The main
Launch engines were as predicted.
Item flight heading. Let's go to flight. Station. And ignition.
Off, ignition.
Thrust is go all engines. That's good.
Shut off.
Shut off. Stages and ignition. Ignition confirmed. Thrust is go. Ignition confirmed. Thrust is go. 11 flight.
Space. The final frontier. For as long as humanity has existed, we have been looking up at the stars and wondering, what's out there? Where are we? What is our place in the universe? Are we alone? We don't know, but we want to find out. Our earliest forms of civilization charted the course of the stars across the heavens. Before the age of maps, compasses, and GPS, it was the stars in the sky that we used to guide our way across this small world of ours. Our own pale blue dot, floating in a black void where every single one of us was born, has lived, and will eventually die. But as the 20th century dawned and mankind conquered the skies above us, there was only one place left to go: beyond the sky itself. And as the last embers of humanity's worst warlike inferno died out, the race was on between the victors to see who would win the war for the stars. From there, I'm sure you all know the story. The launch of Sputnik, with the beep heard round the world, the intrepid first voyage of Yuri Gagarin, and the heroics of NASA's Mercury 7, who all accomplished much, while some sacrificed all. But there is one name in the history of spaceflight that will live on throughout history as our finest hour. The name that encapsulated the hopes of everyone on this earth that we can accomplish something much greater than ourselves. That name is Apollo.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
With those words, Neil Armstrong cemented his name in history on July 20th, 1969. But like almost every great story, fact or fiction alike, once the great deed had been done, that's usually where the story ends. If you're lucky, you'll get a postscript or an end credit scene summing up what happened after, but even then they're often brief one-sentence summaries. To give a short example, it's a sad fact that despite having a crew of 3, Apollo 11's historic mission is almost entirely focused on the 2 men who performed the landing, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. They get mentioned all the time in history classes and textbooks and movies, TV, etc. Yet unless you go out of your way to hear the full story of Apollo 11's mission, Michael Collins, the pilot of the command module, is often reduced to a historical footnote. They read his name as a matter of course as the third guy on the mission, but he never gets his own story told. There's a hashtag for Twitter, hashtag Justice for Mike. Without him, Neil and Buzz aren't getting back from the moon. Hell, they can't even get back into their own ship. And if anything went wrong with the Lunar module, it would be down to Collins and his skill as a pilot to go and rescue them. Now, it must be said that NASA always gave him his due, and the crew of Apollo 11 were close friends and colleagues for the rest of their lives, with Neil and Buzz giving Mike full credit for his crucial part of the mission. But it does demonstrate that vital parts of major events, as well as their aftermath, are often put aside because they don't have the same cool factor. Which leads me to this video, because shooting giant rockets into space is cool, landing on the moon for the first time is very cool, and planting American bragging rights for the next century on its surface ensures its place in every high school history class until the end of civilization. But after that, it's just a big splash into the Pacific, a photo op with Nixon, and then wham bam, thank you ma'am, we're back to the Vietnam War, capping off 1969 with the final wave of Operation Rolling Thunder, and thus humanity returns to its natural state of killing each other. So, today, we're going to tell the story of how Apollo 11 got back home. And if you want to learn more about the space program, one of the best places to do so is on CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is actually my favourite streaming service, with award-winning films and documentaries on literally everything. You just need to pick a subject. Science, technology, health, food, sports, the military, and of course, history. Lots and lots of history. As you know, I always have them up on my second screen while editing, and it just makes time fly by. They have an almost endless selection of exclusive content that you can't watch anywhere else, and when it comes to space, they have an absolutely massive catalogue. It's insane. I personally recommend their various documentaries on the Apollo program and the moon landings, but perhaps the most interesting one is The World Without NASA, a retrospective look at all the scientific advances the space program gave us. Look, it really is the best deal in streaming, but for you dear viewers, it gets even better. If you go to curiositystream.com/Animarchy, you can get unlimited access to the world's top documentaries and non-fiction series. And if you use promo code Animarchy, you will save 25% off. Seriously guys, I'm an actual customer. Pick this offer up, it's worth every cent. Just click the link below or go to curiositystream.com/Animarchy to save 25% off. And thank you CuriosityStream for sponsoring this video. And now we get back to the story about how Apollo 11 got home. After Armstrong took the one giant leap, the two men performed an extended EVA on the lunar surface, deploying the Early Apollo Science Experiment Package, or the ESEP. The ESEP was comprised of 2 solar panels to provide power to the equipment, an antenna and communication system to send data to the Earth ground stations and receive commands, a passive seismometer designed to measure the seismic activity and physical properties of the moon's geology, and a lunar dust detector to measure the dust accumulation and radiation damage to the solar cells. With this done, the astronauts collected surface samples for analysis and conducted mobility tests in the reduced gravity. After 2 hours and 44 minutes, they unveiled a plaque fixed to the ladder of the lunar lander, bearing the words, "We came in peace for all mankind." And as they climbed that ladder, they left a small memorial containing a patch from the crew of Apollo 1, alongside 2 commemorative medals awarded to the cosmonauts Yuri Gagarin and Vladimir Komarov, all brave young men who gave their lives to explore the great unknown. Once aboard, they prepared to rest until Collins in the command module approached for rendezvous after completing his 25th orbit. Though there was a minor panic caused when Buzz Aldrin accidentally broke the ascent engine arming switch while moving through the capsule, which would lead to the lander being their grave if they couldn't arm the motor to get them back up to the mothership. The crisis was quickly averted though. Buzz ended up arming the ascent engine by using the tip of one of the astronauts' pens and jamming it into the hole left by the switch. Humanity's most advanced machine repaired by its simplest. If that doesn't sum up the early space program, I don't know what does. But as the Apollo crew went to bed in preparation for their return journey, their ships hanging in the silent stillness of space, back on Earth there was nothing but frantic activity. Unlike the Soviets, who designed their capsules for the pilots to eject out of them once at a safe altitude after re-entry, giving them the ability to recover their ships inside the USSR's expansive national borders on land, the United States, meanwhile, had access to the world's most powerful navy as well as the world's largest interconnected alliance. Not to mention a water landing allows for a much safer recovery. But locating the capsule, recovering the capsule with the men aboard, quarantining and decontaminating the astronauts, storing and cataloguing the surface samples and experiments, it's going to be a big operation. They're going to need a big ship with a specialist crew. Fortunately, the US Navy had just the ship for the job. The Essex-class aircraft carrier was the titan of World War II. On their flight decks was born the mass-produced industrial might of democracy which crushed Imperial Japan. But now, over 20 years since, through multiple refits and redesigns, the Essex class was now actually one of the smallest carriers at America's disposal, having been supplemented and eventually replaced by the Kitty Hawk class, the Midway class, etc. As such, they had been repurposed for different roles throughout their service lives, with the final one being anti-submarine warfare, with large contingents of helicopters, AWACS, and electronic warfare aircraft for the very purpose of hunting Soviet submarines. So, you have a smaller, more maneuverable ship, equipped with large hangar bays and ordnance storage lockers, while being filled with sailors and airmen who specialize in finding small metal objects in the middle of the ocean. The Essexes were for this reason the perfect ship for the job, and given the task of supporting the space program. And the ship assigned to collect Apollo 11 was the aircraft carrier CV-12, a veteran of the largest naval engagements in history, the battles of Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, and she went by the name of USS Hornet. Hornet had the 4th ASW helicopter squadron aboard, who had been responsible for multiple spacecraft recoveries in the lead up to the Apollo program, while having an experienced detachment of UDTs, expert Navy divers known as frogmen, underwater demolition teams. These 2 units would be responsible for locating the capsule and deploying personnel to decontaminate it while recovering the astronauts. But they still needed a considerable amount of specialist equipment, the most important of which being the MQF, the Mobile Quarantine Facility. Easily transportable by ship, aircraft, or truck, the MQF is based on the famous Airstream line of trailers. However, it received some serious upgrades. Complex atmospheric control systems, multiple ventilation fans with chemical filters, and the whole trailer was pressurized. It also had a complete communication setup, independent backup power, and room for 4 occupants. 3 astronauts and a NASA physician. Hornet had the full quarantine setup of 2 trailers on board, with redundancies for each one, and a mock-up of Apollo 11's command module for training purposes, which Hornet's crew had been making extensive use of. On the 2nd of July, Hornet had picked up the NASA staff required for the science and recovery mission from Pearl Harbor, 200 specialists in all, including all of their equipment. Once this was done, they began an absolutely brutal training rotation. 2 simulated recovery exercises per day, every day, throughout their journey to the Apollo's recovery area. And once on station, they would continue to practice. As the saying in the business goes, there would be no foul-ups permitted. Especially given the fact that President Nixon and Henry Kissinger were scheduled to fly out to the ship to greet the astronauts personally. Which, while necessary given that this was a major national and historical event, it was a huge pain in the arse because it meant, aside from those on operational duty, everyone on the upper decks had to be in their dress uniform all the time. But in fairness, it beats what the astronauts were going to have to wear once they got back. The biological isolation garments, or big suits for short. Speaking of which, back on the Lunar module, Neil and Buzz had their own problems. Rendezvousing with a ship in orbit is a difficult procedure, and despite the multiple tests, it was far from regular process at this point. Having armed the engines with their pen, they engaged the ascent engine while decoupling from the landing component. As they lifted off, the shockwave from the thruster knocked the flag over, much to Buzz's chagrin. Later missions would, as a result, make sure to plant the flag further away, but luckily the camera didn't see it happen, so it still counts. They climbed to 55 miles above the surface, and used the RCS to equalize their orbit at 57 miles high and 13 miles behind the Command Module Columbia's orbit. Once in position, they synchronized their orbits until eventually topping out at 72 miles and within range to initiate the docking process, which I found a really cool animation of here on YouTube. At 128 hours into the Apollo 11 mission, the rendezvous was completed and the astronauts reunited. With their mission complete, they jettisoned the lunar module Eagle and fired the RCS to align for their trans-Earth injection burn. Once in position, they waited until they got to the back half of their orbit behind the moon, and then fired the main engine for 2 minutes and 32 seconds, literally rocketing off the gravity assist of their orbit straight back to planet Earth. Though they did have to make a slight mid-transit adjustment to make sure they landed in the appropriate area. Back on USS Hornet, however, it wasn't nearly as smooth a sailing. Literally. The Hornet had arrived on station, ready for pickup, but wouldn't you know it, as Apollo 11 began re-entry procedures, a tropical storm rolled right into the main recovery area. The complex flight plan set up by Hornet wouldn't be possible. They had several E-1 Tracer AWACS aircraft prepped for tracking and communications with both Apollo and NASA, as well as a team of 4 Sea King helicopters. The aircraft wouldn't be able to operate safely in stormy conditions, and there was a good chance that Apollo 11 would be rendered irrecoverable and sink. Not to mention the strong winds and possible icing could shred their parachutes during the descent, sending them plunging into oblivion, which would not look good in the morning papers. NASA was looking at the weather charts and concurred with Hornet's findings. In fact, one of the officers responsible for finding out about these weather situations was actually breaking protocol because he had access to spy satellites and he wasn't supposed to be. But they ended up saving the mission. They were going to have to move. The astronauts were going to have to come in a little bit hotter and much nearer Hawaii than planned. Apollo 11 reoriented into retrograde and adjusted course for the new landing area. Once done, they jettisoned the final stage, leaving just the capsule, and now revealed the heat shield. USS Hornet, meanwhile, was now hauling proverbial ass to the new recovery area. Thankfully, she was fast. And as Apollo 11's engine burned up and disintegrated inside the atmosphere along with the fuel tank and the other components, the command module thundered down, cutting a fiery streak across the sky, until, as the crack of dawn broke the sky, their parachutes began to deploy, and humanity's first moon mission began its final stage. Hornet had launched their air group just before dawn, and now their E-1 tracers had begun tracking Apollo 11's re-entry. Soon, the Sea King helicopters made visual contact, confirming that the parachutes had opened. And then came the moment everyone was waiting for.
Apollo 11, this is Hornet. This is Hornet. Over. Hello, Hornet, this is Apollo 11, reading you loud and clear.
Cheers went up from those who were listening, but among the crew responsible for recovery, they were still all business. Swim Team 1 aboard one of the helicopters was monitoring the descent of Apollo 11 until the command module splashed down, rather fittingly, 11 miles away from Hornet. They were directly on target with their new landing area too. One problem though. They had landed upside down. Thankfully, NASA had planned for this contingency and fired the inflatables, immediately righting the ship and allowing everyone to breathe. At that moment, the aerial recovery team swung into action. The UDTs jumped into the water and began the retrieval operation. Extra flotational devices were attached, while the astronauts had the big suits thrown at them so they could change out of their space gear. Once this was done, Sea King 66 moved into position over the spacecraft and began winching the Apollo crew aboard. With them out of the way, the Navy divers climbed aboard the spacecraft and immediately began disinfecting and sterilizing every surface, both interior and exterior. As they did this, Hornet steamed towards the site to finalize recovery, while the helicopter containing the astronauts touched down on the deck and was immediately brought into the hangar bay on Elevator 2. Once secured, a plastic tunnel was erected for the astronauts to transfer to the MQF to begin their isolation period, which began with a shower and a change into proper uniform to meet the President. As this was happening, the Hornet's crew fixed a sign to the top of the viewing window on the trailer, bearing the words, Hornet +3, to celebrate the new arrivals. Then, the curtains drew back.
tonight, I want you to know that I think I'm the luckiest man in the world. And I say this not only because I have the honor to be President of the United States, but particularly because I have the privilege of speaking for so many and welcoming you back to Earth. I could tell you about all the messages we've received in Washington. Over 100 foreign governments, emperors and presidents and prime ministers and kings have sent the most warm messages that we've ever received. They represent over 2 billion people on this earth, all of them who have had the opportunity through television to see what you have done. And then I also bring you messages from members of the cabinet and members of the Senate and members of the House and the Space Agency, from the streets of San Francisco, where people stopped me a few days ago, and you all love that city, I know, as I do. But most important, I had a telephone call yesterday. The toll wasn't, incidentally, as great as the one I made to you fellows on the moon. I made that correct, incidentally, in case you didn't know. But I called three of, in my view, three of the greatest ladies and most courageous ladies in the whole world today, your wives. And from Jan and Joan and Pat, I bring their love and their congratulations. We think it's just wonderful that they could have participated, at least through television, in this return. We're only sorry they couldn't be here. And also, I've got to let you in a little secret. I made a date with them. I invited them to dinner on the 13th of August, right after you come out of quarantine. It will be a state dinner held in Los Angeles. The governors of all the 50 states will be there, the ambassadors, others from around the world and in America. And they told me that you would come too. And all I want to know, will you come? We want to honor you then.
We'll do anything you say, Mr. President. Anytime.
As the meeting concluded and the press swarmed the trailer, Hornet's helmsman showed some incredible seamanship as they managed to bring the aircraft carrier right alongside the floating command module within range of the ship's lifting crane without damaging the ship. Once the module was secured, it was brought aboard into the hangar bay alongside the astronauts, complete with the research samples from the moon, which were quickly taken aboard a transport plane and immediately flown to NASA, followed quickly by the President's departure back to Washington. And as the sun began to set, USS Hornet steamed back to Pearl Harbor, where the astronauts would be offloaded and wheeled aboard a transport aircraft to fly them back to Houston as well. And thus, Apollo 11's mission came to an end. The scientific accomplishments of the Apollo 11 mission cannot be understated. The very first extraterrestrial material human scientists had a chance to analyze down to the smallest detail, and by extension, the very first step in the search for alien life. The development of new technology, advances in the scientific method, the core understandings of spaceflight, even the quarantine procedure of the astronauts was revolutionary. And the advances we made came to all of us as well. Artificial limbs, scratch-free lenses, solar panels, sat-nav, the list is almost endless. The early space program, the first great step we took, was, as Jean-Luc Picard might call it, cowboy space exploration. A ramshackle, hashed together bits and pieces of technology thrown at the stars. Completely unsafe. We were, and in many ways still are, just making it up as we go along. Every flight, every project, we're taking risks. Big risks. With many brave pioneers giving their lives. But as another captain of the Enterprise said, risk is our business. It's what these ships are built for. And now to this day, I watched on as Artemis 1 roared into the sky. The perfect execution of their mission. Everything about Artemis 1 went perfectly. There were no mistakes, no errors. Everything about it was perfect. And that perfection was only made possible by the Apollo program. And I won't lie. When I saw Artemis 1 launch, I cried. I genuinely cried manly as fuck tears. Because I knew, like Apollo 11, like the USS Hornet, like the fictional Starship Enterprise, after years of stagnation, after years of simply ferrying people to an aging space station, after all but abandoning space exploration to corporations out for profit, NASA, the people, humanity united, the greatest scientists and explorers from across the world are once again launching into the great unknown. We are once more exploring the final frontier, to seek evidence of alien life, to explore the distant planets of our solar system, and to boldly go where no one has gone before.